Heina mana, ana reo, ro rangatira mā. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you all this evening to our Unisaver webinar, When I'm 65, Heading Toward Retirement. Joining us this evening is Mary Holm, arguably New Zealand's foremost expert on financial literacy, Michael Metzger, Communications Director for Unisaver, and myself, Adrian Cleland, one of your Unisaver trustees. So over to you, Mary. How should we be preparing for when we're 65?
Thanks, Adrian. What I want to look at tonight is firstly the big picture, and then setting a savings goal, and then looking at whether people say to me, look, I've got a debt, I've got mortgage, should I do that before I do the savings? So having a look at weighing those two up. What to invest in, which is pretty pivotal to it all, and then finally looking at where we are at the end of it all. So the big picture, going to look at how long are you likely to live, and when you can expect, what you can expect from New Zealand super. How long are you likely to live? The main point of this graph, I don't want to go into it in detail, is that a lot of people are living well into their 80s and often well into their 90s, and so you've got to assume that if you're fairly healthy, that you might live for quite a lot of years after you retire. Now there's a tool on a website, it's an American website actually, but it doesn't matter, just ignore that, that really helps you work out how long you're likely to live. So the first question you've got to answer on that tool is how is your age and your, can't read it from here. Gender, that's right, thank you. And then you go through and answer a whole lot of other questions on your height and weight, blood pressure. You don't have to know your blood pressure, you just have to know whether it's good or not so good. Family history and so on, right on through to questions about health, diet, driving, whether you wear a seatbelt, etc., how many crashes you've had lately, all sorts of different questions. And the neat thing about it is, as you can see looking back at this slide, every time you answer a question it changes a little age up on the right hand corner there. So you can, as you answer your questions, you can see whether that's improving your life expectancy or decreasing it. And it can actually give you some little tips about perhaps you should do a bit more exercise. You can change your answer there and see if that's likely to make you live longer. So it's quite an intriguing tool to work with. The only thing is that, of course, you might get hit by a bus tomorrow, but we'll assume that's not going to happen. So it gives you a rough idea of what you're aiming at in terms of life expectancy. New Zealand super, there's a lot of questions out there about New Zealand super, whether it's going to start later than 65, whether you'll get less money if you're wealthier. And no, there's no way anyone can answer those questions because the government, we don't know what a future government will do. But I've been involved with a little bit of work with Treasury on this, and I can assure you that they are certainly not expecting New Zealand super to disappear. Quite likely the age might go up, and it is of course possible that a future government might say if you're wealthier you get less New Zealand super. But you've got to think, you're always going to be better off having saved money than not saving money. The government would never set things up so that you're just as well off if you haven't saved money, because otherwise think of the message that would send to young people at the time. So I think you can always be confident that you're better off if you've saved than if you haven't. They're not going to change New Zealand super to that degree. But it will be there, and it won't be too awful, I'm guessing. The current amounts are, if you're single, if you're living alone, it's about $28,000 a year. For a married or de facto couple, it's $42,600, plus you get a winter energy payment as well. So it's not a lot of money, but there are a lot of people out there living on that. But tonight we're going to talk about getting you so that you're living on a lot more than that. So setting a realistic retirement savings goal is an art rather than a science. We'll look at ways to make it easier to get to that goal and look at what happens if you live to be very old. Some tips on how to handle that. Because we don't want people thinking it's not a good idea to live over 90. So setting a goal, I look at it as made up of money for regular spending beyond super and then an extra lump sum. So first of all, looking at regular spending. In retirement, you'll probably spend less on, well, obviously less on work expenses. You won't be saving in retirement probably, and a lot of people don't think that through. They say, well, I've got a certain amount of money at I'm 60 years old and I'm earning a certain amount of money and I'm not getting by on living on that very easily, but you might hopefully be saving a lot of money, and by the time you retire you won't, so you don't need as much money for that reason. Ideally you won't have debt or mortgage repayments. Life insurance, a lot of people with life insurance find that they don't need it by the time they get into retirement. People still have it and they're still paying quite a lot of premiums quite often. Think about what would happen if your dependents if you died, how well off your dependents would be, and in many cases there's enough assets there for your dependents to manage without life insurance, so that's something people often cut back on in retirement. Health insurance, anyone who's getting a bit older will know the premiums on health insurance go up and up, obviously because we're all claiming more as we get older. I would not recommend getting rid of health insurance, because otherwise you're caught in the government's health system, which is good, but you can wait a long time to get, say, a hip replacement or a knee replacement, something like that. I recommend, though, if you're not going to the doctors all that often, maybe get rid of coverage for GP insurance and just stick with insurance for surgery and specialists. Is quite a good way of reducing your premium somewhat. People spend less when they're over 80, despite health costs. People often write to me and say, to my Herald column, and say that they wish they'd spent a bit more in their early retirement. They were scared they were going to run out of money and didn't travel very much and so on while they were still healthy. And then they find when they get well into their 80s and into their 90s that they're living just on New Zealand super. So keep that in mind when you're looking at your spending totals. Also, you've got time to do all sorts of DIY that you might currently be hiring other people to do. So that all helps. So how much for regular weekly spending? Keep in mind that about 40% of New Zealanders, of single people over 65, live on New Zealand super or not much more. So people do get by. It's not easy, but they do get by on just the super. A simple rule for looking at money you might have beyond that is to know that if you retire at 65 with $100,000 in savings, you can spend $100 a week and your savings will last. Note, if you do your sums, you're going to say, no, that's not going to last me all that many years, but in the meantime, the $100,000, what you haven't yet spent, is sitting in an investment earning returns, so it's growing as you're spending it. And so that's a calculation from actuaries that $100,000 gives you roughly $100 a week. If you retire with $400,000, you'd have $400 a week to spend. So it works pretty nicely. Nice simple rule there. If you retire older than 65, you need less money than that, or you can spend more money than that. Is how it works. Any questions? Anybody yet coming through? No? We're all right?
We've had a question about the website, and Michael's answered that.
Oh, good.
Online,
so we're very good. Yes. Okay.
It might be worth just covering, Mary, that a lot of the website addresses and information that Mary's covering tonight are covered on a fact sheet that's available on the webinar link on the homepage of the Unisaver website.
Yes, yeah. So if there's a website or something I'm mentioning, it's all written on that summary. So a lump sum for retirement savings as well, to cover emergencies, trips, cars, new roof. It's not always negative. It might be the grandchild's brilliant idea that you want to invest in. And a lot of people like to start retirement with a good car and a house in good shape and so on. And so it's an idea to think of an amount that you'd like for those sort of extra expenses over and above regular weekly spending. whatever amount would likely work for you. So when we're looking at a goal, we're looking at the lump sum plus the regular spending amount that you think you're going to need. And the rest of tonight we're going to talk about how to get there. Does it look too hard? A lot of people say, oh, help, this is just too much for me. So this is my favourite part of the talk, I think. Looking at ways to make it easier. The first one is to ski. I'll get into that in a minute. We don't actually mean down on Ruapehu if it has enough snow at the moment. Move to a smaller home or lower priced area. Work after 65 or eat your house. So firstly, ski stands for Spend the Kids' Inheritance, which many of you I'm sure will have heard of. But the idea is you just leave the house to the children and you spend the rest of the money, which is a pretty popular idea amongst boomers, not amongst our parents. I think they were much worthier people than we were. I reckon it's fair enough these days for a couple of reasons. One is that houses are worth a lot more. We're assuming here that you will have a mortgage-free house in retirement, of course. They're worth a lot more relative to incomes than they used to be. Go back about 20 years or so, 20, 30 years, the average house was cost about 3 times the average income. And now it's about 10 times. So we all know house prices have got ridiculous, and therefore leaving your house to your children is a much bigger inheritance than it was for, say, my parents' generation. Also, families are smaller. Most people have got 1, 2, 3 children, rather than when I was younger, I was one of 4, and a lot of the families around us were much bigger. So for those 2 reasons, I think it's fair enough to leave just the house. You might not even leave that. We'll look into that shortly. Smaller house or lower priced area. Do you like my little house there? That's what you might be able to afford. Many people move to a smaller home in retirement, either in the same neighbourhood or city, or in a whole different town, a whole smaller town or something like that. I suggest you test the idea first by perhaps renting in the new place for a while and renting out your current home to just see how you like it. Because I know one woman I was talking to recently who had moved to a small town from Auckland. She'd been there a couple of years and she'd got very involved in the community, but she still felt people didn't really welcome her, and she was feeling quite depressed about it. And then there are problems like medical services, which aren't as good if you get out into smaller towns. So just be aware of those sort of problems. If you're planning to move to a smaller house in the same city, perhaps, there can be some issues with that too, in that everyone in that situation wants to move to a fairly new place that's been well maintained, and that is near the bus route, is near the doctors, and because that's such a popular sort of house for people who are retiring to move to, quite often they are very popular, and you don't get much. You sell your suburban house with 4 bedrooms, move into a 1 or 2 bedroom smaller place, and don't free up much money. So just be aware that doesn't always work quite as well as you might have hoped. Working after 65, now this is increasingly common. New Zealand is 65 to 69, 44% of us are working now, which is, and numbers are increasing all the time. There are 2 ways that continuing to work really helps you. One of the ways it helps you is that you've got 1 more year of working and saving. And the other way is that you've got 1 less year of retirement you have to fund. So in those 2 different ways, it actually helps to just work another couple of years. Part-time work ideas for people, because a lot of people say to me, it's all very well for you to say I should continue to work, but I might not be able to get a job, and it's not always easy for older people to get jobs, there's no doubt about it. But you might take up mowing lawns. I know a man who was a chief executive of a big company who now loves mowing lawns in a small community, partly because he gets to chat with all the neighbours. Consultancy, tutoring, teaching your hobby. I know of a woman who has always been taken a pride in decorating cakes for her children's birthdays and friends' weddings and so on, and now makes quite a lot of money doing it professionally. Or you might set up as a handyman. There are all sorts of ideas, all sorts of ways that people can earn a bit of extra money in retirement. And if you just earn even just $5,000 or $10,000 a year, it's surprising how much it can help you, Mary, with your savings.
Just before you go on to the next slide, there's quite a great question here about just going back to the savings target, about how you factor in inflation into setting a savings target.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. Sorry, did you want to say?
I just wondered whether it was included in the $100 per $100,000.
I don't think it is. I'm not sure off the top of my head. It's in my book, the details, but I've always thought with inflation that it's not all that big a worry because people tend to spend less and less as they get older. People say that all the time, that, you know, at 65 they spend quite a lot, they travel a lot and they go out a lot and so on, and then by 70 they're spending a bit less, and by 80 they're spending less again. And I think that tendency kind of counters the inflation problem. If inflation really ran away, it could be a bigger problem, but we're getting assured by economists now that it will probably come back. Yes.
And you make the point too that often people underspend at the beginning of retirement because they're anxious about...
overly anxious. Yes, that can be a problem. Yes. So, that's a good question. Eating your house. So what we mean is people assuming once again that you do have your own home, and for those of you who are watching who don't have your own, that's fine as long as you retire with a lot of money. You need a bigger retirement savings to obviously to cover your rent in retirement, but it can work just fine. But we're assuming here someone's got a mortgage-free home, and what often happens is they've got assets worth a heck of a lot of money, but not that much cash. So there are 4 or 5 ways you can turn that into cash without actually selling and moving to a smaller home. One is to take in boarders or flatmates, and I've got one friend who did that for a while. She lived near a university and she took in foreign students during the term, so she got breaks during the holidays from them, but she loved having them. They helped her cook exotic meals from their countries, and she really enjoyed their company. So don't dismiss that too readily. Sublet part of your house permanently or by Airbnb. Watch out for tax and insurance. You want to tell your insurance company that you're doing it, because otherwise your insurance might not cover your property, but that can work well. Subdividing is a lot easier now than it used to be, because all around the country cities are trying to make it easier for people to subdivide, and so a lot of people have got a big section, can sell off part of their land, do well that way. Reverse mortgages. Now these are, a lot of people will tell you these are not a good idea. But I think they actually are a good idea as long as you do it right. So first of all, what you're doing is borrowing money against your house. The house is the security, and you repay the debt when the house is sold or when you die. Excuse me. The loan grows a lot because you're not making any payments of principal or interest going through the years you've borrowed the money, and so the loan grows a lot. So in our little table here, you might see that at 7% after 5 years, $100,000 has grown to $140,000, and after 30 years it's grown to over $800,000, so 100 has grown to over 800, and that's at 7%. Currently reverse mortgages are about 7.75%. They could easily go up to say 11%, and in that case over 30 years borrowing $100,000 could grow to $2 2/3 million. But what you've got to remember is that over 20 or 30 years, the value of your house is growing as well, and growing a lot over a long period like that. So I reckon they work really well if you do them at older age. You don't want a reverse mortgage to be running for 30 years. It's going to build up too much money if you borrow at 65 and live to 95. Don't move out of the house at that point. But it can work really well for people if they get it at, say, 85 or 90. Personally, I'm planning, if I ever get round to retiring, I'm planning to spend my money up till about age 90 and then get a reverse mortgage if I need it at that point. The thing is that by then a lot of people say New Zealand Super covers their spending anyway. And it's also a good thing to have there for a medical emergency if you wanted to spend money or some other big emergency that happens. You've got that value in the house that you can borrow against. So you can borrow about 20 to 30% of the value of your house at 70, and that amount increases. The bank will lend you more because by then you haven't got as long to live. By the time you're 80 or 90, they will lend you a much bigger percentage of the value of the house. Only borrow as you need the money, though. Don't go and get a reverse mortgage for, say, $100,000 so you've got it sitting in the bank for when you need it, because in the meantime you're paying quite high interest. They charge higher interest than on an ordinary house mortgage because it's riskier for the bank to do it. So you can set them up so that you've got the thing set up, and I think they want you to borrow a few thousand to get things started, but then have the facility there where you can go and add money as you need it, as you go through. Telling your family about this is an interesting issue. Because the family might be expecting to inherit the whole house, and meanwhile you've been running up a debt against the house. I maintain that in most families it's a good idea to tell them what you're going to do, and if they object, that's good reason to disinherit them. That means they're not very nice people. They should ideally be saying, go for it, Mum and Dad, it's your money. So an interesting thing to think about. There's a really good calculator on. Heartland Bank is one of the two banks currently offering reverse mortgages. The other is SBS, two of the smaller banks in New Zealand. Heartland Bank has got a really good calculator on the website that where you can feed in your information, your age and so on, and just work through what you're likely to be able to borrow and how it might affect how it might make inroads into the value of your house, etc. And consumer.org.nz has got a good article on their website on reverse mortgages as well that covers a lot of the details there.
Mary, just
yes.
The talk of housing and owning houses has
yes.
brought up the question of what if you can't afford a house,
yeah.
and what impact that has on your
whole retirement,
retirement planning.
It's now in countries like Switzerland and Germany, parts of Northern Europe, fewer than half the people own their own house their whole life, and it's not a big deal. They get long-term long-term leases to rent, and they are becoming increasingly available in New Zealand, although not as much as in Europe yet.
Sure.
But as long as what I say to people who are struggling to afford a house is just keep saving really hard, and it'll solve your problem either way, because the house prices are coming down, and you might get to a point where you can actually afford to buy one. And if you can't, as long as you hit retirement with quite a big sum of money to cover your rent through until you die, well, you're fine. It's not actually a problem unless you put it in your head as a problem. Yeah, it can work fine.
There's another question here, Mary,
yes.
about houses, around whether you should put your house in a trust so you can qualify for government subsidy when you get to rest home care.
The answer to that would be no, because the government is really clamping down now on people doing that sort of thing. That's the quick answer to it. I wouldn't do it. These days the government's looking a lot more, they say, looking through trusts to what's really going on, who really owns the assets,
sure.
and so it doesn't work well. Yeah. Okay. What if you live to be very old? Set aside money for a charity at the start of retirement, and if you live past 90 you become the charity. is not a bad idea. Or reverse mortgage, or just live on super. As I say, a lot of people get by on just New Zealand super when they're that age, so it can work just fine. Yeah, don't be too scared of living to an old age. Now, how to get to the goal. Repaying debt versus Unisaver or KiwiSaver, and how to boost your savings rate. So looking here at repaying debt, if you've got credit card debt, and quite often credit cards charge 19%, 20%, around that sort of rate. If you've got credit card debt, please get rid of it, make it an absolute top priority. Paying off a debt that charges you 19% is like having an investment that pays you a return of 19% without any risk and without any fees and without any tax. It's unbeatable as an investment. You've really got to get rid of that debt, make that your very top priority. So repaying a mortgage, it's a really good idea to repay that faster too. So this table's got too many numbers to look at really, but if you're looking here, we've got an $800,000 loan and the interest on that would be $745,000, so nearly as much as the loan itself. If you repaid $100 extra per fortnight, you are saving a lot of interest. It amounts to $89,000 less interest. And if you paid off $200 more a fortnight, you're saving yourself $159,000 in interest. And as you can see in the right-hand column, you're paying off the loan quite a lot faster. So it's pretty powerful. If you can just find a little bit extra to pay off a mortgage, it reduces your interest payments and it reduces the term. So it's a pretty neat thing to do with your money. So what to do first? Faster mortgage repayment versus Unisaver, or KiwiSaver for those of you, for partners perhaps. First of all, repay credit card debt. That's top priority. What about the mortgage? I would say you should be in Unisaver and KiwiSaver, as well as paying off the mortgage, because of the subsidies you get from the government and the employer, and because of the diversification you're investing not just in your own home but in a whole lot of shares and bonds and so on. And you're learning about how markets work, which is all, it's really good to be in Unisaver or KiwiSaver over the years and see what happens when the markets go down and you stay put, hopefully, and they come back up again. So there's all those learnings that go on when you're within the schemes, but I would recommend you don't put more than 5% into Unisaver or 3% into KiwiSaver for partners, and beyond that put extra money into repaying the mortgage, getting rid of the mortgage, because it's a nice thing to get that down. If the mortgage is not repaid at retirement, you've got the Unisaver or KiwiSaver money you can use to pay it off at that point. So it's best to be in both. So maximum into Uni and Kiwi to get the maximum from the employer and the government, and then over and above that, hit that mortgage where you possibly can. Boosting your saving, this is basically just saying that you can do it painlessly when your expenses go down. You might have paid off a loan, or the kids leave home. They do tend to come back again, but hopefully they might pay a bit of board when they come back. When your income rises because of a pay rise or a tax cut, when your wealth rises because of perhaps an inheritance, or you win some lotto, or you get a redundancy, all of those are opportunities for you to save some extra. By all means, spend a bit more, have a bit more to spend, but also have a bit more to save, and that's a painless way of doing it. You might want to read about FIRE, which stands for Financial Independence Retire Early. It's kind of a movement that started in North America and it's in New Zealand and so on as well. It's easy enough to just search on the internet for articles about it. People doing that, they're aiming to retire early, so they save really hard. Some of them save half their income. Some of them it's a bit ridiculous, but there are some ideas there on how you might save some money. So how can you boost you can also boost your saving by taking on more risk. So we're going to look at that now, what to invest in. If you're not feeling brave, you might need to have a little bit of courage. So we'll look at different types of assets, and then I can't see what else we'll look at because there's a thing in the way, but never mind, we'll move on. Cash is the basic lowest risk asset. We're talking about money in savings accounts, bank term deposits, etc. I say bank with capital letters because there are other term deposits out there offered by finance companies. They pay higher interest because they're riskier, and I don't recommend them. I think if you want to take on a little bit more risk to get a little bit more return, do it through these other ways, through bonds or property or shares. Those are basic 4 types of assets. So with property and shares, you can directly invest in them or do it through funds that invest in them for you. So this is a graph showing what's happened to different types of investments since 1973. So we've got cash, bonds, property and shares. You can see there in the green line, the top line, which is New Zealand shares, you can see the ups and downs, the big up and down in the 1980s. That was the 87 share market crash in New Zealand. And you can see the red one, the international shares going up and down. That was the tech bubble and tech bubble burst around the turn of this century. And then you can see the global financial crisis in around 08, 09, 10. With both the red and green lines going up and then down again. And you notice also coming through the commercial property, which is the sort of mustard coloured line, and then down the bottom we've got bonds, which are chugging away at about the same rate as inflation. So what the point of this graph is that if you invest in those riskier assets, you're going to have ups and downs. You're going to have times when your investment can actually halve, which is pretty horrible, and you've got to stick with it. But look at how much more you get from 1973. This is $1,000 invested in 1973. By now is worth 120,000 in New Zealand shares and about 70,000 in overseas shares and New Zealand commercial property, whereas it's worth only about 20,000 in bonds. So you can clearly see they're a much rockier ride for shares and property, but much more accumulation over the long run.
So Mary, when you're talking about risk here, you're not talking about losing your money.
No. Good point, Michael. Yeah, we're talking about volatility here. Yeah, okay. The ups and downs. We're not talking about losing your money. No, if you're in Unisaver or KiwiSaver, the funds are not government guaranteed, but they're very closely watched by your funds, watched by a supervisor, a separate company watching the provider and making sure that the investments are going where they should be. The chances of losing the money are very low, so we're not talking about that sort of risk. It's a good point, yeah. Different banks' rates on cash and bonds. So if you're doing term deposits or something like that, have a look at those 2 websites. They both list all the different banks and their different terms of different deposits. Shop around, don't be loyal to your bank because they're not particularly loyal to you. So I reckon you just go and find the best one. Laddering your term deposits. So if you've got quite a lot of term deposits, and a lot of people love this when they learn about it. So what I'm saying here is, let's say you had $40,000 and you wanted to put it in term deposits because you're planning to spend it fairly soon, or you want very low risk with it. You could divide it into, let's say 4 lots of $10,000 and invest one lot from this year to mature next year, another lot to mature in 2024, another in 2025, another in 2026. But then when they mature, you reinvest each of them for 4 years. So the reasons for doing this are that you're getting access to a quarter of the money every year. So every year there's some of the money becoming available to you. It's not all tied up for long times. But on the other hand, longer terms usually pay higher interest. So what you're doing here is at the beginning when you set it up, okay, you've got some only tied up for 1 year and some for 2, some for 3, some for 4. But once you get the thing rolling, you're getting the higher interest that generally comes from investing for a longer term. So that's just something you might want to try. Looking at shares, the best way to invest in shares for most people is through Unisaver, KiwiSaver or other managed funds, because then you're getting a wide range of shares. But you've got to promise yourself, so we're talking the high risk Unisaver and KiwiSaver funds here, you've got to promise yourself not to panic when the shares drop a lot. It's not if, it will happen. It does happen all the time, and it's happened just recently. Actually, people understand that more now than they did a couple of years ago, because we did have a big downturn as soon as COVID hit us, and then we've had another one this year, although the market seemed to be settling down now. If you would panic, start with only small share investment, because you must promise yourself you won't panic. Yeah, well, you can't promise yourself you won't panic, but you promise yourself you won't make a move when you panic. You do not want to move your money at that point to a lower risk investment, be it a lower risk Unisaver fund or any other lower risk investment. That's when the loss becomes real. If you don't move it, it's not a real loss. It's just kind of a sitting there paper sort of loss, and will come right. It always does. But if you think, oh gosh, I would panic, okay, Mary says you can get higher returns taking this higher risk, but I'm not sure I would cope. Start with a small part of your investment. In Unisaver, you can move just some of your money into a smaller investment. Into a higher risk investment, and leave the rest where it is and try it out and see how you go. But don't be too shy, because shares and property move higher than inflation, as we saw in this one back here.
We have a question, Mary,
Yes.
about when to move to lower risk investments.
Yes.
So when you turn 65, do you take all of your money out of high risk and put it into cash?
Absolutely not. No, because you want to. Actually, we're coming to timing
Slide on that.
Yes, well, I might get to it there. More on rental property, it works really well if you've got skill and luck. Two problems in retirement: you can't gradually spend the capital. If you're in, say, shares, you can gradually be spending the money. With a house, the whole house is just sitting there. You can spend the rent, but you can't spend the capital. And there can be quite a lot of hassle with rental property, with tenants or with maintenance problems. You can get a property manager, but then that eats into your returns. So I recommend people think about selling in retirement. Some people still love to be landlords in retirement, and if you love it, if you really enjoy it, why not? But just know you're tying up a lot of the money there. So think about that. Now here we're coming to Adrian's point. What to do with your money. This slide is a really important slide. It's about when you expect to spend the money, not when you retire. If you retire at, say, 65, some of that money you might be spending 25 or 30 years later. So the smart thing to do is put the money you're planning to spend within 3 years in cash, which could be bank term deposits, etc., or into a conservative fund, or Unisaver's got a cash fund, which would be a really good place to put it. And if it's 3 to 10 years, put it in a bond fund or a balanced fund, a middle level fund. And then if it's 10 or more years, put it into a higher risk fund, a growth fund, or whatever. And then every year or two you would be moving some money down from the high risk to the medium and some from the medium to the low as the years go by, to maintain this 3 years and 3 to 10 years, etc. So yes, when you retire, which you were asking about before, a lot of people do that. They move all their money into low risk, and it's a real pity, because they're going to lose a lot of growth if they live for another 20 or 30 years.
Which could be offsetting inflation. Which
absolutely, yes, quite, yes. Yeah, good
There's
point.
Another question here too from Andrew about, once you turn 65 or retire, where to put your money. And of course you can leave your funds in Unisaver after retirement. Which is,
yes, we can probably go into that more on the website.
Sure.
Yes, it's a good place. Keep your money in Unisaver in retirement, yes.
There's just a quick question that here that I'll just chip in with. People asking that they've got extra money, are they better to put it in Unisaver or KiwiSaver? Or you might say something else.
Yeah, so I tend to think it's quite good to put it outside uni or KiwiSaver, where it's not tied up, so you've got access to it, because you never know when you might suddenly need it. Yeah, unless you're one of those people that has to lock it up or you'll fritter it away. And yeah. But so it's a personality thing a little bit. But for most people, it's good to maintain access. Yeah. So shares for the long term. This slide is making the point at the top here. We've got 1 year returns on shares all over the place, some very high, some quite big losses. And then we've got 5 year returns going down to 15-year returns, and the point is that over longer periods it waters down. You get big drops and big losses and profits, but over longer periods it waters down, so you're getting a much steadier growth for your longer term money than looking at it year by year. So 4 rules of investing here. One is be brave. You can see here you've got 8% returns on the right hand side versus 2% returns on the left, especially over the longer periods. How much more your savings will grow if you're being a bit brave and don't bail out when things go wrong. Diversification is a very basic rule of investing. So we've got in types of different assets within each type of asset and overseas. So looking quickly at these different assets, this is just to show you the years across here, and you can see all the different types of investments and ranked by how well they did each year. And just at a glance you can see that some investments do well one year and badly another year. That happens all the time. It's a big mess. And taken from that table, we've got New Zealand cash, New Zealand property shares and world shares, and all of them are going up. And some years they're doing really well relative to everybody else, and other years they're not. It's a big mess. So what you want to do is invest in a wide range of different types of assets, so you don't go with one that does well sometimes and doesn't other times. And then within each type of asset, it's good to own lots of different shares or lots of different bonds or lots of different properties if you can afford it, or do it in a property fund. They won't all crash at once. The easiest way to do it is in a managed fund. They charge fees, but they're much more flexible than accumulating a lot of shares, and most people don't have enough money to buy a lot of different shares, although these days, come to think of it, you can on the platforms, but it's much easier, simpler to do it through a managed fund. One share wonder, I had a letter from a guy in 2020 saying he was up about 250% on what he paid for Auckland Airport. That was in February 2020, and then look what happened. See that horrible crash that happened, especially to Auckland Airport. I mean, a classic example of a share that you'd think you can't really go wrong with Auckland Airport. Back before COVID, it was growing, more and more people are travelling. It'll be fine. Nothing can go wrong here, and then look what happened. There's no way of guaranteeing that a single share is rock solid. Going global, we looked here at Australia, New Zealand and all the big share markets of the world, and looked at the countries that, in the left-hand column we've got the country that performed best in the share market that year, going from 1985 on down, and then the right-hand column is the country that performed worst. And the main point I want to make is that it's all over the place, that different countries do well sometimes and badly sometimes, and the ones that we've coloured in yellow are the ones that went from being best one year to worst the next year, or the opposite, and there's a heck of a lot of them. So it's common for different types of assets, but also different countries to do well sometimes and badly other times. Investing's just a big mess as far as that goes. So it's a good idea to invest globally in a fund that invests in a whole lot of different international shares and bonds. Within Unisaver, you'll find that's what's happening, and in a lot of the KiwiSaver funds and other funds. Is overseas investing riskier? Well, retirement spending, a lot of the spending you're doing if you own your own home is on cars, electronic goods, clothes, that kind of thing, that are imports, and also perhaps you're doing international travel. And the way it works is that you're protected against the Kiwi dollar falling if you've got some of your investments overseas, which you will have if you're in, say, the Unisaver growth fund or the balanced fund. You'll have quite a lot of your investments overseas, and so it's actually less risky rather than more risky to have some of your savings overseas, to counter the fact that some of your spending is either coming in from overseas or you're making it when you're travelling. Might be a bit hard to get your head around, but the point is it's not a high risk thing to do. And the easiest way to invest offshore is through some kind of New Zealand based fund such as Unisaver or KiwiSaver. Past performance is not a guide to the future. We've already been saying that about different countries, different types of assets. You can see it again here. We've got the different types of assets across the top: cash, bonds, property, etc. The red ones are the worst performer that year and the green ones are the best performer that year. And you can see at a glance that some types of assets move from being best to worst or worst to best in a single year or in a couple of years. In other words, you can't predict what's going to happen. Past performance is not a guide to the future. It's not just what they say on the box. It's true. Don't try to time markets. So this graph is showing what happens to it says average mutual fund stock invested, which read that as an average investor in a higher risk Unisaver, KiwiSaver or other fund. They tend to move their investments around from high risk to lower risk funds a lot more than, we're comparing it here with the S&P, the American stock market index, and you can see that the individual investor in grey has done much worse over 1 year in a loss year, and not nearly as well over 10 years or 30 years. So it's much better to just stick with the index fund rather than trying to outsmart it by moving your money in and out. People do it all the time and they nearly always end up worse off for doing it. It's far better to just drip feed your money in and stay put, and it's much easier. Okay, so we're nearing the end here, but want to just have a look at if you forget all else and what to do if you don't reach your retirement savings goal. So look, this is a summary of what we've said so far. It's on the summary sheet, so we don't really need to go through it now. It's basically saving 100,000, spend 100 a week. Ways of making it easier. Priorities: get rid of that high interest debt first. Boost your savings when expenses drop or income increases. And then this is a really important list about your spending. Put money that you're going to spend within 3 years into cash, and then the middle level into bonds or a balanced fund, and then with your 10-year plus money, get it into shares or property. 4 rules are: be brave, diversify, past performance is no help, don't try to time markets. Okay, just one final point here. Does more money equal more happiness? And it's a point made in my book, Rich Enough, which topped the New Zealand bestseller list, but I don't tell anyone. But and because I look into the relationship between money and happiness, and I really like this point that John Nussbaum made about the 3 main predictors of successful aging, which were sufficient financial resources, but a history of good health and network of friends were just as important. So now we're just moving to questions and comments. Any more questions come through?
Well, quite a few actually, and I imagine we'll have to answer some on the website. One was, why not invest in gold or art?
Yes. Now gold is very volatile. If you have a look at sometimes it has terrific gains, but it could also slump a heck of a lot, and you're not getting any income on it. Unlike dividends on shares, rent on property, and interest on other investments, it just sits there. The only gain you get is if you actually sell it at a gain. Nothing wrong with putting a little bit of your money in it, but I would not recommend putting more than maximum 5%. Yes.
Well, I think we're going to have to wrap up. So,
yes.
Kia ora, Mary. You've covered a lot of ground, interesting and useful as always. Thank you for joining. You'll find a fact sheet on the homepage of the Unisaver site. Just click on the Mary Holm webinar tile. There's information about joining, and I hope you found it useful. And thank you, and pa Mārie.